In November 1983, a routine NATO training exercise was mistaken by the Soviet Union for the opening move of a real nuclear war. Soviet nuclear forces were quietly placed on heightened alert. Bombers were fueled. Warheads were made ready, and almost no one in the West knew how close it had come until years later, when the files started to leak. This is the story of Able Archer 83 and what it reveals about how easily two people can look at the exact same event and walk away terrified of completely different things. To understand why a training drill could almost trigger a war, you have to understand the mood in Moscow in 1983. By this point, the Soviet leadership was old, sick, and deeply paranoid. General Secretary Yuri Andropov had spent years running the KGB before taking power, and he genuinely believed the United States was preparing a surprise nuclear first strike. This wasn't idle fear. In 1981, Andropov launched a real intelligence operation to test that theory, codenamed Operation Ryan, short for the Russian words for nuclear missile attack. KGB and GRU agents around the world were ordered to watch for any sign that the West was preparing to strike. Lights on late in government buildings, unusual troop movements, even the buying patterns of blood banks. Meanwhile, on the American side, President Reagan had just called the USSR an evil empire and was pushing an aggressive military buildup. To Washington, this was deterrence. To Moscow, it looked like the prelude to a war. Two governments were reading the same headlines and arriving at opposite conclusions. One thought it was posturing. The other thought it was preparation. In early November 1983, NATO ran a scheduled exercise called Able Archer 83, a simulated escalation to nuclear war, used every year to test command and control procedures. On paper, it was routine, but that year, it was run differently. New, more realistic communication procedures were used. Silent radio periods mimicked a real crisis. Government leaders were simulated as moving to secure bunkers. To an outside observer without inside knowledge of NATO's playbook, it could look identical to genuine war preparation. Soviet intelligence, already primed by 2 years of Operation Ryan paranoia, was watching closely, and some officials became convinced this wasn't an exercise at all. It was cover, the real thing, disguised as a drill, so that if the West struck first, they could claim it was just an exercise until the missiles were already in the air. According to intelligence assessments declassified decades later, some Soviet air units in East Germany and Poland were placed on heightened alert. Nuclear-capable aircraft were reportedly readied. The exact scale of what happened on the Soviet side is still debated by historians, but multiple declassified reviews agree that Moscow's alarm was real, not performative. And the terrifying part is this: NATO had no idea any of this was happening. From the Western side, it looked like just another autumn exercise. Meanwhile, on the American side, President Reagan had just called the USSR an evil empire and was pushing an aggressive military buildup. To Washington, this was deterrence. To Moscow, it looked like the prelude to a war. Two governments were reading the same headlines and arriving at opposite conclusions. One thought it was posturing, the other thought it was preparation. The reason we know how frightened Moscow really was comes down to one man, Oleg Gordievsky, a senior KGB officer stationed in London, who had secretly been working for British intelligence for years. Gordievsky had direct access to Soviet cable traffic and had personally seen how seriously his own government took the war scare theory behind Operation Ryan. When Able Archer began, he understood immediately how it might be read back in Moscow, and passed warnings to his British handlers that the Kremlin's fear was not posturing. It was sincere and dangerous. That intelligence reportedly made its way to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and, through Allied channels, to President Reagan himself. Multiple accounts credit this moment, a defector's first-hand account of genuine Soviet terror, as one of the turning points that made Reagan realize the Soviets weren't just playing tough. They were scared, and a frightened nuclear power is more dangerous than a confident one. In the following years, Reagan's rhetoric noticeably softened, and both sides eventually moved toward the arms control talks that would help end the Cold War. Here's what makes Able Archer worth remembering: not the missiles that were never launched, but the mechanism that almost launched them. Nobody lied. Nobody acted in bad faith. NATO ran an exercise it had run before. The Soviet Union genuinely believed what its own intelligence apparatus had spent years training it to believe. Psychologists call this mirror imaging, the assumption that if I were in your position, planning what you're planning, I'd behave the way I would behave, so I'll interpret your actions through my own logic, not yours. NATO assumed the Soviets would recognize a drill for what it was, because NATO knew it was a drill. The Soviets assumed NATO would understand why an exercise dressed as a nuclear war looked like a real threat, because that's exactly what it would have meant if the situation were reversed. Neither side was irrational. Both were reasoning carefully, from evidence in good faith. And that combination, sincerity plus a wrong assumption about the other side's intentions, came closer to ending the world than almost any deliberate act of aggression in the entire Cold War. Able Archer 83 didn't end in disaster, but historians still argue about exactly how close it came. And that uncertainty is itself unsettling. It means the safety margin between routine exercise and actual launch wasn't a wide gap. It was a handful of misread signals in a command bunker, corrected only because one man was willing to risk everything to make sure both sides understood each other. If you found this one unsettling, subscribe. Every week I dig up another story history almost forgot.